The wind swept harshly through the Colorado plains that morning, tugging at the hem of Eleanor Whitmore's long wool skirt and scattering dust across the station platform. The train had just pulled away, its whistle still echoing faintly in the canyon, leaving behind the quiet clatter of her trunk and the pounding of her heart. She stood alone, a single figure dressed in muted gray, with a wide-brimmed hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much grief for someone not yet 30. She hadn't spoken a word during the journey from St. Louis, not to the conductor, not to the woman who'd tried to make polite conversation, not even to the porter who'd helped her down. Silence, once a painful wound, had become her armor. And in the untamed town of Ash Bluff, where her late husband's last letter had beckoned her, she prayed it would be enough. A man approached from across the dusty road, tall with a rifle slung casually over his shoulder and a limp that spoke of war or hard living. His eyes were the color of worn saddle leather, his beard trimmed with care, but no vanity. He didn't smile, just lifted his hat in greeting. "You Eleanor Whitmore." She gave a small nod, hands tightening on the leather handle of her valise. "I'm Jonah McCrae, sheriff here. Your husband, Adam, he—" Jonah paused, jaw tightening. "He was a good man. Real sorry for your loss." Her fingers twitched at the name. Adam, the man she'd married in haste, who'd ridden west ahead of her to start their life together. The man whose body now lay buried under the hard ground of Ash Bluff, shot dead before she ever arrived. "I'll take you to the house," Jonah said after a pause. "It's small, but it's yours now." Adam worked the land best he could, left a few things behind. The ride was silent save for the creak of leather and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The town disappeared behind them, giving way to scrubland and the soft gold of prairie grass swaying in the wind. Jonah didn't press her for words, didn't fill the quiet with empty talk. She was grateful for that. When they arrived, the homestead was just as Adam had described in his letters, modest but strong, with a porch that faced the sunrise and a small barn leaning slightly from years of storms. Eleanor stepped down from the wagon, boots crunching against the dry earth. She stood for a long moment, staring at the place where her future had once lived. "I'll leave you to it," Jonah said. He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything, I'm up the road. Town's not far. Folks'll talk, but they mean well, most of 'em." Eleanor nodded again. Jonah touched his hat brim and rode off, dust trailing behind him. Inside, the house was neat, sparse, a single pair of boots by the door, a shirt folded over a chair, a journal on the table, open to a page half filled in Adam's rough script. Her breath caught. She traced her fingers over the ink, then over the blank space where a sentence had never been finished. That night she didn't light the fire, sat instead on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, watching stars bloom in the sky. And when a coyote howled in the distance, she didn't flinch, just watched, just listened. She wasn't sure what she had come for anymore. Closure, maybe, or to prove that silence didn't mean surrender, but something about the stillness of the plains, the way the land waited patiently for nothing and no one, made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she wasn't entirely alone. In the days that followed, she worked, cleaned the house, cooked simple meals, walked the property. Adam had planted young apple trees behind the barn. Most were scraggly, but one had held on, branches thin but upright. She touched the bark gently and murmured her first word in days. "Grow." It was a whisper, but it was a beginning. By the end of the week, word had spread through Ash Bluff about the widow who didn't speak. Some pitied her, others speculated, but no one dared bother her. No one except Jonah McCrae. He came by on the 6th day, dismounted without a word, and handed her a bundle wrapped in cloth: flour, beans, dried apples. "Town heard you might be short on supplies. I added the apples myself." She looked at him, her green eyes unreadable. "I don't expect thanks," he said, looking off toward the trees. "But I do hope you'll stay. The land remembers those who tend it, and you look like a woman with roots." Eleanor looked at the bundle, then at him, and finally she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going. Ash Bluff did not know what to make of Eleanor Whitmore. A week turned to 2, and still the widow barely spoke a word. She walked into town only when necessary, never more than once a week, carrying a woven basket and a calm that unsettled people more than any sob story might have. She wore no black veil, no overt signs of mourning, just practical dresses and a pair of scuffed boots. And always, always silence like a second skin. Children whispered about her like a ghost who wandered by daylight. The blacksmith's boy claimed she never blinked. Old Miss Gentry at the general store said she must be mad. God took her voice with her husband. But the women at church weren't so sure. Some of them had buried sons. They understood that silence could be a form of faith or defiance. Jonah McCrae watched it all quietly from his office window, thumbs hooked in his belt, hat pulled low. He had seen plenty of things in his time. Bandits, fires, broken men. But there was something in the way Eleanor moved through grief that made him uneasy. Not fear, not pity, respect maybe, or something he couldn't quite name. One morning near the end of October, she arrived in town with a bundle of herbs tucked beneath one arm and a list written in precise cursive. She handed it to the store clerk without a word. As she waited, someone entered behind her. Loud booted steps and the scent of stale cigar. Clayton Burr, half rancher, half drunk, all nuisance. Big voice, bigger opinions. He squinted at Eleanor like she was a riddle he didn't like the look of. "Well, look what the wind blew in. Widow Whitmore herself." She didn't respond. "You got a voice under all that wool, or you just think you're too fine to speak to the rest of us?" The clerk fumbled behind the counter, eyes darting. Still, Eleanor said nothing. "You know, some say a quiet woman's hiding something." Burr leaned closer. "Could be you're not mourning your husband at all. Could be you had a hand in his end." That did it. Before anyone could react, Jonah was there. He hadn't even been in the store, but he must have heard the tone from across the street. His hand clamped down on Burr's shoulder. "You finish your business here, Clayton, and move along." Burr turned, mock surprised. "Just having a friendly chat." "Your kind of friendly gets men buried." "Go," Burr grumbled, tipped his hat mockingly at Eleanor and left. The store felt several degrees warmer in his absence. Jonah didn't look at her directly, just nodded at the herbs in her hand. "Medicinal?" She gave a small nod. "For what?" A pause. Then she reached into her coat and pulled out a folded page, torn from a medical book, with sketch diagrams and handwritten notes beside them. Remedies for burn salve, a treatment for pain, tea for fever. He read it, then glanced at her. "You planning to open an apothecary?" She looked at him, eyes steady. Then she picked up a pencil from the counter, flipped over the paper, and wrote, "I help where I can. That's all." He nodded slowly. "That's enough." 2 days later, the fire came. It started at the saloon. No one quite knew how. Some said a tipped lantern. Others whispered about Burr's boys getting reckless. All Jonah knew was that by the time he reached Main Street, half the row was ablaze. People ran in all directions, tossing buckets, shouting for water, forming frantic lines. Jonah barked orders, sweat streaking down his brow, lungs aching from smoke. They fought to keep the flames from reaching the church, the school, the livery. It was chaos. And in the middle of it, Eleanor Whitmore arrived. No hat, no shawl, just a pale blue blouse, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a bucket in each hand. She moved through the smoke like a ghost made of iron. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Just carried water, handed bandages to the injured, and pressed cool cloths to scorched flesh. At one point, a boy, barely 10, was pulled from the rubble of the saloon porch, his leg mangled and bleeding. People shouted, someone wept. Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers already unwrapping strips of linen. "Is he?" the mother sobbed. Eleanor didn't answer. She pressed a poultice to the wound, then reached into her satchel and pulled out one of the very herbs she'd bought days earlier, crushed it, pressed it to the bleeding. Jonah watched her from across the smoke-hazed street, something tightening in his chest. Later, when the fire was finally contained, the street soaked in ash and sweat and grief, he found her sitting on the steps of the church. Her hands were raw, her face streaked with soot. He sat beside her without a word. After a moment, she reached into her coat, pulled out the same pencil and paper, and scribbled something. She held it out. "Sometimes you don't need to speak to be heard. Jonah read it once, then twice, then nodded. Yeah, he said quietly. I hear you just fine. Ash Bluff had always been a town stitched together by necessity. More grit than grace, more dust than charm. But in the days after the fire, something shifted. The saloon was gone, 2 homes damaged beyond repair, but nobody had died. And that, folks agreed, was a kind of miracle. They talked about the sheriff's leadership, about young Danny Rourke pulling his paw from the flames. But mostly they talked about Eleanor Whitmore. She never flinched, Mrs. Gentry told the preacher. Walked straight into the smoke like she'd done it before, said the blacksmith. She's got something steel in her, muttered Clayton Burr. Though quieter now, and with fewer teeth after a bar stool incident no one questioned too hard. The town, once wary of the silent widow, now watched her with something bordering on awe. And yet Eleanor herself remained unchanged. She returned to her homestead, replanted the garden, brewed her medicines, spoke rarely, but when she did, once or twice a week now, never more than a few words, folks listened like it was scripture. One crisp morning, as the first snow threatened the distant peaks, Jonah McCrae rode out to her place with a wagon full of salvaged lumber. You need a barn wall, he said simply, glancing at the one that had begun to rot through on the north side. Eleanor, standing on the porch with her arms crossed, raised a brow. Jonah shrugged. A storm will bring it down. I can fix it. She pointed to the tools already laid out in her yard. Neat. Ready. He blinked. You were going to do it yourself? She tilted her head as if to say obviously. Jonah scratched the back of his neck. Well, I brought a hammer anyway. She didn't smile exactly, but the corner of her mouth twitched, and it was enough to light something in Jonah's chest he hadn't felt in a long while. They worked side by side that afternoon, Eleanor in silence, Jonah occasionally humming under his breath. The sky turned the color of tin, the wind sharp with the scent of snow. At one point, Eleanor handed Jonah a hot mug of something herbal. He sipped, winced. Tastes like regret. She gave him a look. He cleared his throat. Kidding, it's good. Strong. She didn't reply, just went back to hammering. By sundown, the new wall stood proud. The wind couldn't touch it now. Jonah leaned against the barn door, flexing his shoulder. You're not just surviving out here, he said. You're building something. Eleanor didn't answer. He turned to her. You ever think about leaving? She looked out across the plains, the dying gold of the grass, the pale outline of distant mountains, and shook her head once. This land's got you now, huh? A pause. Then softly she said, It listens. It was the first thing she'd said to him in over a week. Jonah blinked. You speak. She shrugged as if it were nothing, but he smiled. That's so? And then, bolder, do you think it might ever talk back? Eleanor didn't answer, but she didn't walk away either. Instead, she sat down beside him on the porch bench, their shoulders nearly touching, and for a long time they watched the horizon together, silent, steady, unspoken things passing between them like sparks in firelight. The first snow came like a whisper, soft, unannounced, blanketing the Colorado plains in a silence so complete even the coyotes held their breath. Eleanor awoke before dawn and stepped barefoot onto the porch, her breath misting in the crisp air. The world looked different in white, softer, quieter, like even the land had chosen to match her silence. Inside, the kettle warmed on the stove and the fire crackled low. She didn't light the lamp, didn't need to. The snow reflected what little moonlight was left, painting everything in silver blue. She opened Adam's journal again. It had sat untouched since the day she arrived. She had read every page, memorized the loops of his handwriting, traced her fingers over ink stains where he'd corrected himself. But today something nudged her toward it, some ache in her chest that hadn't yet scabbed over. There were letters tucked in the back, unsent, addressed to her. The first one was dated 2 months before his death. Ellie, the soil's tough out here, rocky in places, but I planted anyway, apple trees, just 3. They'll need more care than I know how to give them, but I figured you might take to them. I miss the way you brewed coffee. I burned a pot last week. The sheriff came by thinking something had caught fire. I hope you still want this life. even with all its dust and quiet. I dreamt of your voice last night. Adam. She folded the page slowly. Her fingers trembled, but not from cold. A knock on the door broke the stillness. Jonah. He stood on her porch, hat in hand, boots already damp with snow. Didn't mean to wake you, he said. She stepped aside and let him in without a word. He glanced at the journal in her hands. You read 'em? She nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more, but instead he unrolled a parchment and laid it on her kitchen table. I got a letter, he said, from Fort Laramie. They're requesting additional marshals. Word is, trouble's coming up from the south. Raiders, maybe, or worse. Eleanor frowned, the kind that reached her eyes. Jonah read it for what it was. Worry. I'm not going, he said quickly. Not yet. Town needs someone here, and... He hesitated. You make it hard to leave. Eleanor stared at him. Not cold, not surprised. Just waiting. I don't know what I am to you, he said, and I don't need to. But I'd rather ride into a storm with you beside me than wait for another goodbye letter from a man who left alone. Silence. Then she reached out and picked up Adam's letter again. Folded it. Set it aside. She looked Jonah in the eye. Then slowly, deliberately, she said, Don't ride alone. And though her voice was quiet, it was clear, strong. Jonah's breath caught. Is that a promise? She gave the barest nod. He stepped forward, brushed snow from her shoulder. Let his fingers linger just a little too long. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, turning the snow into fields of fire-kissed diamonds. Inside, two people stood inches apart. No vows, no confessions. But something unspoken passed between them, and this time, it wasn't silence. 3 days after the sunrise vow, Jonah rode into town alone. He left Eleanor standing on the porch, arms folded beneath her shawl, eyes trained on the trail like a hawk who'd learned to expect loss. He'd promised not to ride alone, but sometimes duty didn't wait for plans. Ash Bluff had gone uneasy. A shipment of dynamite headed for the North Ridge mine had vanished. A horse was found outside town with a riderless saddle and dried blood on the pommel. And every man who'd ever carried a badge knew what that meant. Someone out there was cutting through the silence like a blade. Jonah's presence at the general store turned heads. The way he asked questions turned stomachs. And the note tacked to the saloon door that morning, written in a trembling, unfamiliar hand, turned everything else to ice. The widow ain't the only one who's lost something. We're coming. And we're taking it all back. He didn't show Eleanor the note that night, just said, lock the doors, keep the fire low. She didn't ask questions, but she added a second rifle to the wall and loaded it herself. The next morning, the stranger came riding down from the ridgeline, dusty, ragged, a red kerchief over his mouth and a long, jagged scar down one cheek. He dismounted right at the edge of Eleanor's orchard, didn't knock, didn't speak. Just stared. She stared back from the porch, the rifle across her lap. You Whitmore's girl? He finally asked. A nod. He spat in the snow. Thought so. You've got his mouth. I've got more than that, she said, voice calm. The man's eyes flicked to the rifle. He chuckled. Fair enough. I'm not here for blood, lady. Just came to see what's left of the man who took my brother's land. Your brother sold this place, she said. Under duress, the man replied, not blinking. During the war, while bleeding out and half mad, this patch of dirt used to be ours. Eleanor rose slowly. And now it's mine. Not for long. He turned and mounted his horse again. Best be gone before sundown, widow. It's not just me this time. As he rode off, Eleanor didn't shake, didn't cry. She simply walked back inside, locked the door, and placed Adam's letter, all of them, into the wood stove. There would be no more reading the past, only preparing for the fire to come. They came at twilight, 6 riders, faces hidden behind bandanas, rifles slung loose, horses frothing with speed and tension. The orchard was still, branches bare, wind picking up just enough to tangle the clouds like bruises across the sky. Eleanor stood on the porch, hair tied back, rifle loaded, a second pistol at her hip. She wore no dress, no lace, just canvas and leather and the steady weight of a woman who'd had enough things taken from her. Jonah was beside her, silent, watching the horizon the way only a man who's buried friends can. "They'll want blood," he murmured. "I'm done bleeding," she replied. The first shot wasn't theirs. It came from the barn. A warning, not a wound. A crack that echoed through the valley like a ghost remembering. Jonah had placed 3 townsmen inside the barn. Old veterans. Quiet men with sharper aim than gossip gave credit for. Eleanor had insisted. If war was coming, she would write the terms. The gang rode forward anyway, confident, desperate. And when the front man, scarred, wild-eyed, the one who'd spit on her orchard, lifted his rifle, Eleanor pulled the trigger first. He hit the ground hard, didn't get up. What followed wasn't a shootout, it was a reckoning. Jonah moved like a shadow, his limp forgotten. Every shot he fired counted. Every movement was deliberate. Eleanor took out a second rider from the porch steps, then another when he tried to flank through the apple trees. The barn lit up. 2 riders fell there. The last man dropped his gun and rode off screaming. The wind settled. Jonah exhaled slow. And Eleanor? She didn't move. Didn't even lower her rifle for a full minute. Then finally she sat down on the steps and said the first prayer she'd uttered in years. Not for forgiveness, but for peace. By morning, word had traveled faster than the snowmelt. The widow who wouldn't speak? She'd held the line. Sheriff McCrae? Still standing, still limping, still dangerous. And the orchard? Still growing. Jonah offered her a deputy badge weeks later. She laughed in his face. Not cruel, just tired. "I don't need a badge," she said. "I've got roots." And she did. The kind you don't dig up. The kind you build towns around. The kind that keep growing, even after the wind stops howling. And so, across these unforgiving lands, another tale drifts away with the wind. If this quiet courage, this stubborn heart touched you in any way, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and pass this story on to someone who needs it. Don't forget to subscribe, because out here there are still so many truths left to tell. Each one carved from pain, hope, and dust. This is Wild West Stories. Thank you for watching.